Thank you, Sachin, and I would like this session to be very informal because I'm just giving you a short overview of what has been done. I would like to talk about my experience as a researcher, as a PhD and MA supervisor, and also as somebody who frequently gets papers in international journal as a peer reviewer. So specifically papers in World Englishes or English worldwide, they frequently come to me anonymously when they're dealing with Indian English. So I'm quite aware of what goes on or what other people have done for their research. So, and also feel free to ask at any time. What I would like to stress is what you can do, or I would really very, very much encourage you to do your own field work, to do empirical research. You live in a country with one of the highest degrees of linguistic diversity. There's so many interesting language issues around which you can just go out to explore, and some of the tools like questionnaires, like corpus work we've already been discussed, we have already discussed. So what I would like to do is give you an overview with examples of what you could do. And with what you could do, I mean especially I could tell you, well, this project, I know this person took this person 6 months to do that. This was more like a PhD project. This is something you can do for your MA. And don't forget, we have so many modern technology around which comes more or less free. You can download an app for your mobile phone, which is a voice recorder. You can go out and sample speech. You can create questionnaires and disseminate them online. A student of mine did that for her research on English as a lingua franca. So there's so much out there for us ready to use. We should make more and better use of what we already have. And keep in mind, you are a native speaker. I think most of you are native speakers of at least one language. So you are living embodiments of multilingualism and its instantiations. So if you are interested in a specific feature to study, so first of all, what are you interested in? Of course, these questions are not always independent of each other. So research domain, research question, hypothesis, they frequently interact. And then, of course, you have to calculate how much time do I have. Is this supposed to be an MA project or a PhD project? But what you could be interested in, you could be interested in the structural levels of language, or you can also be interested in the societal levels of language. But let's start with the structural levels. You could be interested in the lexicon. I uploaded a book on slang in global English, specifically for 2 participants here who expressed their interest in underground language. So there's one paper by, forgot his first name, but his second name is Lambert, who is working on the lexicography of Indian English, and he writes about Indian English slang as evidenced in dictionaries. And he says there are many words which are quite regular in English, which used to be slang in other varieties. So you can try and trace their meaning. So that would be one example of looking at the lexicon. What is frequently being done is indicate the level of word formation which includes Indian words in English. So what kind of words from Indian languages enter the English language, but also the other way around. I remember my very, very first evening in 2004 in Pune in a restaurant when Professor Gokhale took me, and we asked him, can you please get the waiter to bring me another pineapple juice, because I didn't know the word. And the professor said, "Ik pineapple juice." I said, oh, I could have done that, yeah. But so there's so many words, or the word hanger, which I just learned, coat hanger. I requested coat hangers from the guest house, and the word is hanger in Marathi. There are interesting possibilities of studying loan words either this way or the other way. If you speak a local language which has the feature of gender, then if you borrow a noun from English, it has to be assigned a gender. Where does that come from? My language, German, has gender, so every word we borrow from English, it has to be assigned gender. That means we have the gender is seen in different kinds of articles. We have masculine, feminine, and neuter articles. Is that the same in the languages that you speak? 2 genders or 3 genders? 3 genders. So you borrow something from English, it has to be assigned a gender. You borrow a verb from English, it has to be assigned somehow to the inflectional patterns, to the tense system of the language. How does that happen? For example, sooner or later, typically with borrowings, the pronunciation is changed. It is adapted to the local language. And again, this works both ways. So loanword integration is a big topic. Then you can also, of course, study the lexicon. There are articles in World Englishes which say, is there a core vocabulary of English? For that, you would have to study, you can do that with the help of corpora, which kind of words are shared across all varieties of English, which are specific to one variety. You can use the keyword function from ANCONC and create a list or a comparison of vocabulary which is either typically Indian or typically Sri Lankan, or what is there, what they two have in common, what is separate. So the lexicon as such is a very, very rich source, and this is a lot has been done already, but not much, for example, has been done on English words entering the different Indian languages. The level of morphosyntax, morphological features, syntactical features. Remember that if you subscribe to Schneider's theory of the evolution of post-colonial Englishes, he said where the post-colonial Englishes, South Asian Englishes differ most is at the level where the lexicon meets the grammar, at the level of lexicogrammar. So he was talking of slightly different patterns, slightly different in the sense that there may be quantitative differences but not necessarily qualitative differences, that you have new combinations of verb and particle, for example. So this is again something you can best study on the basis of a corpus. You can also study that, but I would like to leave that for the next session where I will talk about the comparison between English as a second and English as a foreign language. You can also study that in your students' writing. But again, this discussion I would like to postpone for the next session. Just as an example that if you're a teacher, you have so much material every week, I assume, that you have to correct anyway. And so what has been in focus was what you call verb complementation patterns. So verb particle combinations have been studied a lot, or as I said, the transitive and intransitive use of verbs, or what we just call the dative alternation, ditransitive constructions. This has been studied a lot. And we would also have to add the light verb constructions. And as I said, we come back to that, how you explain that possibly. Then when you look at semantics, not that much has been done on that actually. One of the reasons being that it's difficult to catch this with a corpus. That means, well, how do you catch the meaning of a word? That takes a lot of reading, it takes a lot of intuition. One starting base would be to start with a lexicon and find out what are the similarities and differences in terms of sheer frequencies of a word, and then you could find out, are there any cultural connotations which are specific to that word in that language? And there you would be ideally placed to identify such cultural connotations, because somebody who is not a native of South Asia might fail to recognize these. One example, I never knew what communal meant before I came here. It has quite different connotations in other contexts. I think here for everybody that's very, very obvious and very frequent word, and there might be other cultural connotations that disappear unless somebody who has grown up in this cultural context notices that. And you could say on the border of semantics and pragmatics are patterns we talked about yesterday when we talked about intercultural pragmatics. So there might be specific patterns of interaction. So you could say what I used yesterday as an example of what is typically of the pragmatics of South Asia would be the extended kinship terms. So this belongs on the one part to the lexicon, also in semantics, but when you use it, it belongs to pragmatics. So are there patterns of interaction which are typical for South Asian languages? How would you study that? Yesterday we got started on that. You can study with that with a questionnaire, but you can also study by your own introspection. You see, how do I do this? What is a typical pattern of interaction for greetings, for taking leave, for making a request, for threatening somebody? How do I express this? In this level, even though it's not in the strict sense a structural level of language, the whole study of discourse markers would also belong. Discourse markers, like what in British English is well, you know, something like that, they're not really part of the structural level of the language because they do not have an independent meaning. They have an interpersonal and intertextual meaning. So a word like well doesn't really have a lexical meaning that you can pin down. The meaning depends entirely on the context. And how these are used differently from one variety through the next might also be quite interesting. Has anybody already thought about an interest in one of these areas? Yeah?
Pragmatics.
Pragmatics? So you got interested in that, yeah? And since you're from two different cultures, you might also already indicate two different angles on that. Yeah?
Morphosyntax.
Yeah? Yeah, if you say morphosyntax, that's not necessarily, you make a distinction between word formation and morphosyntax is more about the grammatical elements of the morphology. For example, inflectional endings. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know whether you mean word formation?
Word formation? I think I know.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else? So you could, if you start your research idea, you could start from what do I really want to look at, what do I find more interesting than other things. You could also start from how much time I have, or you could also start from a specific theory and say, well, I find that interesting and I want to make a contribution towards that idea. So for example, you might think, well, I like this epicenter idea, so how can I further our knowledge about that? Well, how should my research project look like to fit into this theoretical framework? So so you always need a research domain, a research question, and a methodology. But if you want to start somewhere, you can start at either end. You just have to make sure that in the end it somehow fits. I remember I had a course in my home university about English in India, and I also stressed language policies. And then somebody came to my office hours and says, I want to write a paper on how English influenced India. So I said, yeah, so how are you going to do that? This is a very large topic. How much time do you want to spend with this? 40 years? Something like that. This is a general idea, but it's so broad and so vague that you have to break it down and see what aspect you want to study and what is your hypothesis. If you just say English influenced India, nobody will doubt that. So what is your hypothesis? And then how are you going about to verify this? So when you we looked first at what can be your research domain, the structural levels of language. We can also be interested in the sociological level of language. So how does language and society interact? This goes into the direction of language policy, language attitudes. And we just had an example of how do you study language attitudes. And again, this can easily be done in some respects with the help of questionnaires. Sometimes a lot of research can also be done by looking at the available data, census data, for example. This is also very important for looking at language policies, or you can investigate the educational policies of your state, of the nation, and then perhaps do a study of how much of that policy is actually implemented or whether it's just on paper. So we talked about attitudes, the attitudes towards norms and standards, and also the attitudes towards multilingualism. For example, within the European Union is a community of about 400 million people. It has 24 official languages. The most widespread language is English. And there are studies of attitudes, which languages are most sought after by learners. This is always English. So these would be large studies, but you can also make a small study, and we just saw an example of that by doing an attitude study comparing people's attitudes towards local reference varieties. And you can do that with the form of a paper questionnaire. There are also online tools which help you to create an online questionnaire. Then you can send the link to your friends and ask them. This is a typical approach in sociolinguistics, the friends of a friend approach. You get hold of 10 friends and make them find another 10 friends so that you, in a very short time, when your friends are very obliging, you would get a lot of data. So attitudes towards languages from a sociolinguistic perspective are very important because they might determine the future of a language. If you find that a speech community itself attaches low prestige to its language, if it's a minority language which has low prestige from the majority speakers and also from its own speakers, then people may shift their language. So attitudes may determine the life and death of a language. And this is something you can investigate. So you could say multilingualism and code switching is, sorry, there's a misspelling here. Multilingualism and code switching is one phenomenon which is on the one hand on a societal level, it's also on the other hand on the structural level of language. And since you're all multilingual, this can easily be investigated. I've been to a conference in Germany, in the capital of Berlin, and there's a sizable Turkish community in Berlin. And somebody presented her it was a BA project, and she basically recorded conversations between her and her friends, so a small all-female group who are all proficient speakers of German and Turkish, and she documented the extent of code switching they do. When you look at code switching, I'm sure you all do that. When you look at code switching, you can either investigate at what point in a sentence do you code switch. So do you do inter-sentential code switching? So finish one sentence in one language, take up the next sentence in the next language? Or do you switch within a sentence, intra-sentential code switching? So are there any structural patterns that you can observe? And you can easily do that with just a couple of hours recording that you take with your cell phone. You can also try and find out, are there any specific reasons for you to code switch? So one of the explanations, or within the list, the catalog of explanations for code switching, what has frequently been put forward is, first of all, there are some terms. It's not that people lack a specific word in code switching. I think we talked somewhere in the very beginning that there are some terms like essentialism which are so specific that you just take them over. So some terms are so specifically associated with a specific culture that it's much easier to code switch than to translate that. So that would be one reason for single term switches. But then we already had this example, perhaps if you get very excited, you then tend to code switch. Or sometimes if you want to change the topic, you might code switch. So when you want to look at code switching, first of all, you can look at how you do it, at what stage in your language, and then why. And since we also talked about hybrid and mixed dialects, how much prestige does that have? I think I mentioned the example of early research on multilingualism and code switching, where code switching was seen as a deficiency, as an impurity of the language. And what Schneider wrote in his 2014 article is that now code switching or mixed hybrid varieties may carry more prestige in a young urban population because it demonstrates a high degree of linguistic creativity. This is again something you may find out. In case you have families, you have children in your house, perhaps they demonstrate code switching, what are your own attitudes towards that? Do you encourage that or do you stop that? Has anybody ever talked to you about code switching? Stop that. That's not pure Marathi or something like that. Another point is language policies. So this is not so much about going out and doing field work. This is about studying the laws, the educational reforms of your country, of other countries. Sorry. And I have, for example, done that and looked at the language riots in the early 60s in the south of India, and tried to find out why people reacted in the south so violently against the imposition of Hindi as a sole official language. When you look at language policies, if you want to explain the differences in the penetration of English into society between different South Asian countries, you also have to look at the language policy. Sri Lanka, upon independence, first made Sinhala the sole official language. So in a way, the minority language Tamil was more or less not recognized in the constitution. We had language conflicts which erupted into social conflicts, into civil war. English for a very long time was not an official language. Then later on, both English and Tamil were also recognized as official language. Sri Lanka now states in the constitution that English is the link language. It doesn't say between whom, but it is officially recognized. The national language of Bangladesh is Bangla. And so what kind of provisions are made for English in the constitution? How much does this affect the local population? I gave the example of Singapore, where English is a key language to be taught in school. And this notion of English knowing bilingualism is very, very successful in the sense that Singapore has now more native speakers of English than ever before. And for these language policies, you can review language policy documents. You can also review the census figures. So for Singapore, we have evidence from the census figures that there's a high increase in young people claiming English to be the language they speak at home. And again, you can also investigate language attrition. Attrition is language loss and language shift. And this has been done on a larger scale for different communities within India. For example, there's papers on a group of speakers of Sindhi, so the Sindhi community in Delhi who shifted. There's also interesting papers about the opposite of language attrition and shift, that is language loyalty. For example, Bengalis tend to be extremely loyal to their language. So wherever they are, and for many generations, they keep the Bengali family alive in the Bengali language alive in their family. The United Nations, the UNESCO, has a devoted website to endangered languages. And that's an interactive website. You can click on it. You can find a specific language that you might know of here in India and see they have a criteria for saying this language is threatened. And one of the main criteria for saying a language is threatened on a societal level is if it's no longer a living language in the home. If it doesn't get support is one point, so it's a couple of points. But the main point is if it's not disseminated in the home, then it's under threat. And so you could check that, perhaps from the languages that you know. Is there evidence, do you know, of a specific community in your neighborhood which is undergoing language shift, loss of the original language? Do you know people who live apart from their original community? Does their language change somehow? Does it become simpler because people are no longer in touch with the original community? And this is something you would have to do on a larger scale. So this is more like a PhD project. You would have to get in touch with the community. So perhaps not an MA or MPhil, rather a PhD project. So these would be different research domains which are all legitimate areas of inquiry. Some of them are easier to do for an aspiring scholar. Some take more work where you would need co-workers to go around. But are there any questions, comments so far on these different research domains within linguistics? If not, what is your research question? Of course, your research question depends very much on what you've already read. As I said, if you're interested in the epicenter hypothesis, then you would have to review, and we've just done that, what has already been written, what kind of methods have been employed, how can I frame my research question so that it fits or makes a contribution to this particular effort. We've done a lot, we've covered a lot of ground, and as I said, the dominant paradigm in the research on post-colonial Englishes and then also South Asian Englishes is Schneider's model of the 5 stages. And this model also implicitly encourages to look for differences. So implicitly, the more advanced, the more different in some respects a variety is from British English, then this would indicate that it's more self-confident, more endonormatively stabilized. And this is why all these quantitative differences which you can catch with a corpus, with corpus status, in a way make sense within this particular framework. But you do not have to adopt this framework. It's just once you have prepared the literature, once you have found articles or other views which in a way contribute to what interests you, then you would try to position yourself within that and say, well, is this now exhaustively researched, or can I also make a contribution? As I said, Schneider's model would be one very dominant paradigm right now. When it comes to your methodology, so sooner or later this all has to match and add up. So again, review of the sorry, that was backwards. Both qualitative and quantitative paradigms are around. Sometimes you cannot really separate them. So if I'm interested in a purely grammatical feature which doesn't carry much difference in meaning, for example, the dative alternation, these are just 2 ways of saying the same thing, but you can't say one means something else. Then you could make a quantitative study on the basis of that. If I look into, for example, this form presentational itself, before I can go to the quantitative analysis, I first have to look, is there really a difference in meaning? So I first have to look at all instances of itself that I find, then I have to discard those which are reflexives. So I have to investigate all my examples within a context. You can also do purely qualitative work. So quantitative is not a necessity, but it just so happens that within Schneider's framework a lot has been relying on corpora, and then you sooner or later end up doing quantitative studies. And you can do comparative studies. I mean, those who are trained in literature frequently do that anyway. So you compare 2 different authors of national varieties, or you look at the subject of romantic love in this author and in that author. So that would be a very, very common way of conducting a study. You can also compare, for example, so these are just examples, you can compare Indian English patterns with American English patterns, or you can compare Indian English with Sri Lankan English, or you can, in a way, like all the studies we just reviewed based on the South Asian varieties of English corpus, you can review something which happens across South Asian Englishes. And the quantitative study would be then something you get specific data, you get differences, and then what is interesting, how do you explain that, which then links us back to our research question. What is the general research framework? In what kind of framework do the patterns that I find make sense? And you can use corpora. As I said, you don't have to. That really, again, depends on your research question. If you want to use, if you want to pursue a corpus-based approach, make sure you first check what is out there, because corpus compilation, specifically when it comes to spoken corpora, is very time-consuming. Perhaps somebody has already done it for you. And we yesterday reviewed a list of corpora which are already available. You can get them from the Oxford Text Archive. I said if you want to create your own small corpus, this is again not so difficult, but for something like the SAFE, South Asian Varieties of English corpus of 18 million words, this takes some time to set it up. So make sure you are aware of what is already out there before you venture to do something else. And then, of course, if nothing that is already available matches your research interest, then you can go for your own purpose-built corpus. And when you happen to know somebody who's very good at computers, and you can get them to write programs for you to automatically extract stuff from the web or to do automatic annotation. So we came from research domain, hypothesis, methodology. These are the three things that if you come to your supervisor or anybody else you want to discuss your project with, these are the three questions that you have to be able to answer. So what do I want to investigate? And why do I want to do this? What is my research hypothesis? And what is my method? Again, where you start of these three doesn't really matter, but in the end it should give a coherent picture. And as I said, questionnaires are always a very good research tool for pragmatics. You could also use them for semantics. For example, what does communal mean to you? Then you can either leave that open or you can give people something to cross in. What does this word in this context mean to you? So you can do that. You can also use questionnaires to investigate the correctness of something. Do you consider this correct in Indian English, yes or no? So this has all been done. So these are not necessarily all separate, they can be. And another method that comes from basically from sociology, these are so-called qualitative interviews. I quoted Devyani Sharma, who did that with her research subjects in the US. She interviewed them in a very open fashion. So these interviews take some time, 1 hour, 2 hours. So what is your experience as an Indian in the US? So how do you rate this? So you would typically have only a couple of guiding questions and then let people talk. So you don't come with a checklist of statements. So what you say to this, to this, to that, you would try to get them to talk. And then, of course, you would not transcribe everything they said, but you would look for specific cues. What kind of attitudes come out of these interviews? And typically, if you want to make a description of a specific variety of English, if you would, for example, take the interviews not only for the content, but also for the dialect they're spoken in, then the more relaxed somebody is, the more natural their speech is. Then you would also be able, if you're interested in studying specific phonological features, to catch people at their most relaxed. So this is basically it. And I would now like to invite you to share with me what would appeal to you most. Again, start with domains, research domains, or start with research hypothesis or research methodology, and think about what would be a suitable topic for you. If you have any ideas, I would invite you to share them with the audience. Perhaps we can help you refine them.